Dear students, I welcome you to another session of my course, Development of Social Thought and Classical Social Theory. Today I am going to discuss briefly about the famous German philosopher Immanuel Kant. I will discuss his philosophical and moral philosophy. I will focus on these two dimensions of his thought. Kant was born in Germany in 1724 and he died in 1804. He spent all his life in the town of Königsberg and he was also the graduate of the University of Königsberg. He lived at a time, as you know, was the time of enlightenment. 18th century was the time of enlightenment in Europe. Throughout the Europe there was a new awakening and there was a new cultural activity going on. Kant was also deeply influenced by the enlightenment and the age of reason. He was seeing with his own eyes that there was a profound rise in the ideas of secularism and the hold of religion was declining and decreasing in the Western social and cultural system. He was worried on the one hand, and he was also happy on the other hand. Worried because the hold of religion was weakening, and due to that, the weakening of Christianity in the West European society led to decline in moral and ethical practices. And he was happy on the other hand because he saw that the use of reason as a source of knowledge was increasing and people's reliance on dogmatic belief and blind faith was decreasing, which was having a positive impact on the growth of scientific and creative innovations within the European society. The scientific revolution which shook and took throughout the European societies was the product of the age of revolution particularly, and Kant was also part of that revolution, part of that age. Now his fundamental philosophical idea, you can say, is best summed up in the following form. He was writing at a time when two philosophical traditions, two philosophical ideas, or two ways of knowing the world, two epistemologies were competing and contesting with each other at that time. One was rationalism and the other was empiricism. Rationalism was, for example, was represented by René Descartes, a French philosopher, Leibniz, Gottfried Leibniz, a German philosopher. Then in rationalism we find Avicenna, ancient medieval classical age Muslim philosopher, and similarly there are other important rationalist philosophers. So the fundamental way of knowing in rationalism is that the reality exists inside the human mind. Reality is the product of human mind. It exists independently of the sensory experience. It has nothing to do with the senses and the external world and how it influences. There is a world of ideas, there is a pure world of ideas, and human mind has an access to those ideas, and it is on the basis of those ideas that our understanding and our relationship with the reality is established. Our understanding and our construction of the reality is formed. That is rationalism. On the other hand, empiricism, that emphasized on sensory experience as a source of knowledge. And English philosophers like David Hume and Berkeley and other people, they claim that the source of human knowledge is not inside the mind, but it is outside. It lies in the world and it is through the sensory experience, through 5 senses, that the datum or the data is received by the human mind and then processed, and then our conceptions about reality are formed. So, these were the two competing epistemologies at a time when Kant came, and it was here at this moment that Kant wrote somewhere, he paid a great tribute to David Hume, the English philosopher. He said that I was in a dogmatic slumber, and his book on understanding human knowledge just woke me up from my dogmatic slumber. And he, tried to combine in his epistemology. Immanuel Kant tried to combine the best features from rationalism and empiricism. So, you can say the Kantian epistemology is a synthesis of rationalism and empiricism. In other words, he says that the categories of understanding, as the categories such as space or time, are, you can say, they are part of our mental structure. Our mind cannot comprehend and cannot categorize, cannot generalize its experience of the external world, its experience of the reality per se, without the use of these concepts. These concepts are inbuilt, they do not have an independent existence, they are the part and parcel of the mental structure, the cognitive structure of human beings. But on the other hand, he validated and accepted the relevance of the sensory experience. He said that new knowledge is acquired by the sensory experience of the world, by the human beings. It is their interaction, it is the interaction of human mind with the external world, with the external nature, that he acquires new knowledge, and then that new knowledge is framed into the general, deductive and rational concepts of human being. So, it was this moment that he pronounced his famous term that of Copernican revolution in philosophy, that he said that just as Copernicus brought a revolution in astronomy, wherein he said that Earth is not the center of the cosmos and the universe, rather Earth is part of the solar system and Sun is the center of the solar system. Earth is just a small planet within that system. It is not the center of the universe. In the Ptolemaic geometry, Earth was the center of the universe. But in the Copernican geometry, so you can say Copernicus displaced and de-seated the central place of Earth from the astronomical thinking, scientific thinking of human beings. In that vein, he borrows the symbolism of Copernicus. He calls that his work in philosophy is just like Copernicus. It is a Copernican revolution in the sense that in the previous philosophical traditions, it was thought that the mind is imposes its structure on the objects of understanding, on the external reality. The concepts, categories of mind, they give meaning to the objects in the external world. He said, my task is the other way around. The objects of understanding, they fit into the mental categories. You see? So, this is the revolution. It is not the mind who is, fitting into the external categories. The categories of mind fitted on the external objects, but the external objects such as table, such as mountains, rivers, plants, human beings, animals, all these objects in the external world, they fit themselves into the eternal and inherent mental structure of human beings. So, this was the Copernicus. He accepts the primacy of man's mental ability to create concepts to which the objects of reality conform, and not the vice versa, that the new objects, the objects of reality are creating new mental structure. No, he says mental structures are permanent, categories of understanding of mind are there, and it is the objects of understanding that who conform or who relate or who fit into that mental structure. So this was the, and sometime it is, and this became, you can say this Kantian epistemology became the most basic and most fundamental structure of most of the 18th and 19th and 20th century philosophy, European science, European biology, European chemistry, physics, whatever, in whichever area you go in, you will find the influence of Kantian epistemology, the way of creating knowledge, the way of looking at knowledge, and the way of knowing the external reality. So this was his, and he wrote a book by the name of Critique of Pure Reason, in which he showed the limitations of human reason. Critique of Pure Reason means the limitation of human reason. But that doesn't mean that human reason cannot, it means that it is the reason. The ultimate limit of knowing the reality or the world is the reason, human intellect. And we don't need any more religion or the dogma to understand the reality, which was already rejected by the Christian societies of the Europe. They have rejected the Christianity during Enlightenment, and they were now relying more on the use of reason, and they were trying to establish a society on rational basis. They were trying to establish a rational society, and they claim that through parliamentary, through representative democracy, a social and political system can be formed and established, contrary to the Christian view, in which some king is ruling the state, controlling the state, and guiding and leading the people. In the Enlightenment, this was changed, and Kant said that human reason can now form rules and laws on the basis of which the society can be organized and progress and develop. So after epistemology, his very other important idea was in ethics, and that was the concept of categorical imperative. He developed this concept because he was observing that religion was declining. In the 18th century, in the 17th century, in the 16th century Europe, if you look at the history of the European society, West European society, you find the dominant role of Christian ethics, Christian morality, Christian theology in the life of the ordinary Western European people. So due to Reformation and then Renaissance, Reformation, and then the scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th century, Enlightenment, and the Newtonian revolution in the 17th century, the materialism was replacing idealism. Secularism was replacing religious dogma. So with the weakening of the hold of religion on the lives of the member of society in the Western Christendom, Kant was very much concerned about the ethical and moral foundations of the society. So in order to fulfill that gap, and in order to support that you can say function, moral function of the society, he came up with the idea. He said that ethical and moral life is very important, because it is through the sharing of duties and rights and duties that a balanced and harmonious society is established. And if we have no concept of morality or ethics, how can we form a balanced and harmonious society? So if the religion is now being replaced and thrown out of the lives of the people, Christianity is no more relevant to the social life of the Europeans. So what else? So you can't leave the vacuum. So he proposed the new ethics, and he said that, and this categorical imperative is basically, he says that you act in a fashion in such a way that action becomes a universal law. For example, in the Bible you find that thou shalt not steal. In Bible there is a verse, it's a universal law that stealing is bad. Thou shalt not kill. Murder or homicide is bad. Killing of a human being is bad. So he said that moral sense, ethical sense is ingrained in the human being, and it is through the use of intellect and reason we can assess that sense, ethical sense, and we should apply our ethical sense in such a way, our moral sense in such a way that when you act, that becomes a universal law, that everybody is bound to follow that. He says that habits and customs of the society can be changed, can be different, can be multiple, can be pluralistic, but the moral and ethical fabric of the society is general and universal in nature, and that is based on the rational understanding of human behavior. Man is a creature who is bound by certain norms, who is bound by certain values, and who is supposed to perform certain duties in relation to father, in relation to mother, in relation to his brothers, sisters, and the larger society. So, if there are no duties and if there are no responsibilities, how can then there be rights? How can you enjoy rights in the social system, in the cultural system? So, all that then trickles down and boils down to the basic notion that you need an ethical system, an ethical sense, and that you can say is the moral law, universal moral law of Kant, that you act in such a way that it becomes a universal law. If you will not lie, for example, if you don't steal, if you don't kill, automatically your fellow human beings, your fellow citizens, they will follow that, and they will not steal, they will not commit murder, or they will not lie. They will understand the importance of truth. So, and then his other important contribution was his some philosophical and political views about enlightenment, because he was also the man of enlightenment, and in 1784 he also wrote a very important article titled "What is Enlightenment?" And in enlightenment he developed a discourse, an analysis on man's freedom and autonomy. For him, the freedom and autonomy of human being, of an individual, was of a fundamental importance, was of a paramount significance. He said that it is the liberty of an individual which makes a society progressive, prosperous, peaceful and harmonious, and a society which cannot protect the liberty of an individual cannot be declared a civilized society. So, he saw in enlightenment a great energy and a great power and a great source of action to put the human beings on an autonomous and free pedestal. He said that if human beings want to achieve autonomy, if human beings want to achieve and realize the true potential of their freedom, all they have to do is to understand the power of reason, to ask questions and to ask basic questions, and they should not be afraid of it. It is only by using intellect and reason that a person can come out of his or her dogmatic slumber, which Kant himself experienced when he says that I was in a dogmatic slumber, and when I read a book written by David Hume on understanding human knowledge, I was just shaken, and I came out of it, and I realized how important it is to understand the reality. So, ultimately it rests upon the citizen, member of the society, individual member, to use his reason, to use his critical ability to situate and understand his existential reality, where he is, why he is, and where he is going to do, what is his role, what is his duty, what is his responsibility within the larger social system. So, these are the three important areas in which Kant, there are other areas he wrote about aesthetics, about the concept of beauty, and he also wrote about aesthetics, he wrote about history, but that requires another session. Right now we have discussed his philosophical, his moral, and some of his political and social ideas. Thank you very much for today. If you have any question, you are welcome.